All right, welcome back to the Ottawa studios of Inside My Canoe Head. I am your host, Dr. D. Today, we are talking about a culture of preparedness. This is going to be one of my most epic episodes. So sit back, grab yourself your favorite beverage. Let's get at her. All right, thanks again for joining us here on the podcast. We are approaching episode number 300. We've been here for 4.5 years, downloaded in almost 60 nations around the world. The top 10 nations are everything from the United Kingdom to Canada to the United States of America to Kenya, and on every continent, Antarctica. And somebody once told me that they heard somebody listen to an episode at a station. I have no idea if that's true or not. We'll just leave it at that. So we are downloaded on every. The reason we say that is we have a portal here to discuss. We have an opportunity to discuss transformative issues within preparedness, ideas that will help you adopt a prepared life, help you build the conversation about building community resilience, strengthening social capital and our relationships, understanding that social capital is our relationships and our propensity to want to connect and be in a community with each other, and that social capital establishes those relationships, and that is the capital on which other capitals flow. So the flow of financial capital between friends and organizations, the flow of physical goods, loaning goods between friends and organizations, and the flow of human capital, which is education between friends and organizations, only happens when we first establish relationships with each other. The very foundation of preparedness as an art or a discipline is the fact that we live in a community. It always starts and must start with each individual person looking that incredible individual in the mirror and saying, I accept responsibility for my outcomes. Success or failure, it's my fault. The reason for that is that defeats the ridiculous ideology of victimhood, that somehow I'm oppressed, I'm prevented from doing things. It takes your situation into account and you saying, okay, I may not be in an ideal situation right now, but I know that every step forward from this situation, success or failure, it's going to be as a result of the decisions I made and not because of a lack of privilege or ridiculous idea like that. So setting that aside, when we talk about a culture of preparedness, we take it all the way back to almost the civil defense days when emergency management as a discipline was starting to emerge. Civil defense was really the idea all the way back, if you want to use a UK frame. It started before the Blitz bombings, but it was basically the idea that to successfully navigate significant events, we require community and whole of society engagement. And I'll talk about whole of society in the modern frame later in the podcast. But really it started with the idea that the government alone, irrespective of how well it's funded or how well it becomes, simply does not have either the capability or especially the capacity to be the savior and rescue everybody and help everybody and be the force of good that people wish it could be. Reality speaks differently. So that whole of society, the culture of preparedness born out of the civil defense era, was we all have a role and responsibility to our fellow residents to contribute collectively to a greater sense of safety and, in the event of a significant disruption, greater success. You can look at data points from all around the world. When you look at earthquakes, urban search and rescue teams, heavy and lighter search and rescue teams do take people out of the rubble, but on a per capita percentage basis, they are incredibly low. The vast, vast majority of people taken out from underneath rubble in earthquakes are done so by residents. Now, could those residents use a bunch of education and training? Yes, absolutely. And it's available in the German THW model. It's available in the America and the Southeast Asia CERT models. The education is there, and we should be doing a far better job to do it. But in the end, you will be rescued not by the public sector services, but more than likely by your neighbors and friends, right? You will be fed, watered, and housed in this significant disruption by your neighborhood, your friends, your colleagues, the people that live around you, your community, for lack of a better term, which is why when we look at the number one indicator of communities that bounce back better, and not just to a better state, but a pre-event state with the least amount of disruptions, are the societies that have a strong sense of social capital, internal sense of place, sense of belonging. It is not linked to socioeconomic status, and your financial status and your financial resources are not correlated in any way, shape, or form in the data to better post-event outcomes. A lot of people believe that the rich just do better. No, the rich don't do better. In fact, but the number one strata within the socioeconomic spectrum that has the best post-event outcomes is the working poor. And now some people don't like that label of, okay, so lower on the social, you can pick whatever label that you find emotionally appropriate for that. But the individuals who have the cultures that have wonderful barbecues in the park, if you've ever noticed on a Saturday or Sunday, and you go to a community park, there are large barbecues where you have 40, 50, 60 people from an extended cultural group or socio group that are out having barbecues. These are not, from a pure economic perspective, groups that are making a high amount of income, but they have an exceptionally high level of social capital. By evidence going all the way back hundreds of years, when we looked at data from Southeast Asia, from Japan, and recent data from Hurricane Katrina across the United States of America, the groups that do have better post-event outcomes are those with the highest degree of social capital. So it's your sense of belonging, your sense of connectedness, and your personal responsibility to those around you that leads to better post-event outcomes. And more, and somebody put it really, and if you've read Dr. Robert Putnam's work, published in his famous work, Bowling Alone, and the modern version of it as well, it basically gets down to membership, right? He looked at the fact that membership in collective organizations across America was falling from the 1950s, 1960s, 70s, and onward, and continues to do so. And as such, we are less connected. And somebody put it very bluntly, or very not bluntly, but very succinctly, as saying, when somebody on a lower economic status needs a cup of sugar, they are more than likely going to knock on the door of the person next to them to ask to borrow a cup of sugar, creating a social tie and a social relationship. Somebody with a higher degree of access to financial resources is simply going to get in their car and they're going to go buy the sugar, right? You might see, look, they're privileged because they can do that. But in fact, what they're not doing is they are not creating the greatest single indicator of post-event outcomes, which is building social capital. So when I am in need, do I go to my neighbor or do I go to the store, right? That's one of the clear indications. When you look at the membership levels in community organizations, they are inversely correlated to income. As income rises, individuals are less connected to their society. They spend less time volunteering, and they spend less time as a member of either neighborhood, faith organizations, etc. When you look at lower income strata across pretty much, I've seen the data from Southeast Asia. No, sorry, not Southeast Asia. I stand corrected. I've seen the data from Australia. I've seen the data from North America, both Canada and the United States of America, and the data from the OECD nations, what captures a pretty good swath of the global north, as we like to refer to it. Lower incomes have a far higher membership and community involvement, and they have a far higher involvement in faith communities. Now, and it doesn't matter what faith community, one is not necessarily stronger than the other. The Sikh religion, for example, has its own embedded disaster response relief agency that's part of the construct of their church, right? Of their religion. It's a permanent part of their religion. So membership in faith organizations, community organizations, lead to a higher degree of social capital, and that higher degree of social capital is correlated to better post-event outcomes, which is why I argue that the number one thing we need to be doing to help increase a culture of preparedness within the population is more programming at community centers, believe it or not. It's not the current messages, but we need to do what we know leads to better post-event outcomes. Now, back to the discussion about the culture of preparedness. So as the world modernized, right, as more and more technological abilities came out, and we went from wells and septic to common sewer systems, common water systems, what we did is, rightfully so, and I'm a huge proponent of a modern technologically enabled society. I think it's done great things and leapfrogged the human condition to much higher standard. But as we adopted more and more of these technologies and more of these systems of support, as I call the 10 sectors of critical infrastructure, there's 16 in the US. They vary generally around the world as to how they're categorized. Sometimes they're called lifelines, but essentially it's your water, your health, your food, your transportation, your government, your financial system, your cell, your information technology. All of these systems work in the background. Every day we get up and we just assume a myriad of systems are going to work, right? And so we transfer the responsibility for personally providing us this service through payment, right? So we pay a water bill. We pay a power bill. We pay we pay a company to build our house. We don't build our own houses anymore. Or if we decide to rent, we pay somebody to rent. We don't build a house and then rent it out. Which is perfectly fine. Like, none of these advancements are bad, right? We don't create our own cell phone network. We pay a company for access to the cell phone network that they connected, and everybody's okay. What we've done throughout this is, in the initial stages, knowledge retained to where, as we adopted more and more technologically enabled, we maintain the skill set to provide that system when it failed, right? We had a culture of people who knew how to grow food. We had a culture of people who knew how to build things. We had a culture of people who knew how to communicate and do all of these other things that were made far easier by the modern technologically enabled society, but we used to have the ability to do that. Over the last 30 years, really, I think it began somewhere around 1998 or 1999, depending on which literature you listen to or follow, we saw a fall off of the skill transfer. We no longer taught these skills in our public education systems. We no longer transferred these skills between individuals, and we crossed what's referred to as the 2-generation gap. We had a gap. We had a generation that moved into a high-density urban and suburban area, but still retain knowledge, experience, and history of a certain set of skills. When you look at the 2-generation gap is when the second generation born to that generation lives in the same, but that knowledge is not transferred from parent to child or through social relationship systems, through social capital community organizations. Once you cross that 2-generational gap, we had a fall off in the late 1900s as to where we no longer had a society that maintained the skill set to replace the critical infrastructure, is what it boils down to. So when one of the 10 sectors of critical infrastructure fail, we've lost the skill set as to how do I replace it. So what we've done is, by adopting these wonderful, incredible things, but not backing them up with education, we've adopted a culture of dependency. So now we're not only having much better, higher quality of lives by living in a modern, technologically enabled world, we're absolutely dependent on it, and we've lost the ability to replicate the system when it fails. Now, modern critical infrastructure in the global north, not in the global south, but in the global north, works at a very high degree. We've done research at my firm back in the United States, and when you look at critical infrastructure fails in North America, and this is just data from Canada and the United States of America, you're looking at about a 93% recovery rate within the first 14 days. So it's about 6.7% of critical infrastructure does not recover after 14 days. And that is the event where you have critical failure. That's where you have a Moore, Oklahoma tornado that takes out the entire water treatment plant, and it's going to take a long time to build it again. Or the power station is taken out by a flood or something like that. But generally, the critical infrastructure gets back online in a modern technologically developed society within 14 days, which is why 14 days is part of our education system, and part of what we tell people is the appropriate space for preparedness, which means when a piece of critical infrastructure fails, because it will, it's very infrequent and we're very glad for that, but when a sector of critical infrastructure does fail, it will be back on within, statistical average will tell us, within 14 days, but that creates a preparedness gap. Right now, we have a dependency where the population is looking at through a lens is, if the potable water system fails in the city of London, England, it is the city's government's job to give me water while I'm waiting for the water to come back on. That's a culture of dependency. They've transferred responsibility not only for the regular normal operations, but when there's a break in operations, we've now placed the responsibility, an impossible task, an absolutely impossible task. So you're setting up the system for failure intentionally because you're not accepting responsibility for that. That's the culture of preparedness that we're trying to encourage through a paradigm change in preparedness communication that we advocate for at Preparedness Labs Incorporated, our parent company here at Inside My Canoe Head. It's on our website. It's in our books. It's on our video course. A culture of preparedness means that I choose to live in an incredible technologically enabled society, but that I understand that periodically and infrequently, but not zero, there's a chance that one or more in a cascading effect of those sectors of critical infrastructure will fail, and it is my responsibility to provide for myself and those for whom I'm responsible for in the period while it's being restored. It's really that simple. That's a culture of preparedness. It doesn't mean living in a yurt. It doesn't mean running off grid. And it certainly doesn't mean buying crap. I've spent much of the last year and a half fighting this idea that there are economic barriers to preparedness. I've fought it viciously in conference presentations, in online debates. I've done several podcast episodes over the last couple of years on it. Economic barriers to preparedness do not exist. They are constructs of the state. When the state tells people that you need to buy things to be prepared, which there's no evidence to support, and I've studied 40 years of preparedness literature, there is no evidence to say that your level of preparedness increases by the acquisition of any number of goods. When the state puts that message out, it is the state that creates the barrier. It's the state that creates the need for financial involvement. What that means is then when you put a survey out and you put as one of the options that is finance is a reason why you're not adopting preparedness, again, you're giving people the option to reinforce the falsehood that the state puts out that somehow your economic status in life is a barrier to you adopting preparedness. There are two things that are required to adopt preparedness, and neither one require a financial investment. The first one is education. Now, we do a deplorable job in the public sector. Governments at all levels in every country across OECD, except for two that I've studied, Norway and Sweden. Other than those two, every country that I've studied does a deplorable job of providing public sector resident-facing preparedness communications, right? You don't tell people to do things that are research-based and evidence-based. You tell them what they needed to do in the time of civil war to get ready for a nuclear holocaust. That's it. That's the grounding of the current message. Have a kit, be informed, and make a plan are grounded in civil defense era language that is no longer appropriate for our modern technologically enabled society. So you need to provide accurate and research-based education. Now, We need to do a far better job. There are some barriers reaching people because some people don't have internet access. Some people don't have the ability to download and print things at home. I get it. There are methodologies that need to be done that don't cost the recipient any money to provide appropriate levels of education. And I've written at length, and I teach this in the capstone course that I teach for a master's in disaster and emergency management education. I teach my students the idea of social network identification and social network analysis by moving preparedness education through existing trusted networks that exist in society. So I teach the skills to be able to both identify the presence of social networks, identify key leadership, and then be able to persuade, influence, and access those levels as an emergency manager to be able to disseminate this information. So number one is first create the appropriate education standard and disseminate it through the network so that people, irrespective of their socioeconomic condition, have access to the education. The second one is build social capital, full stop. The number one thing you can do to adopt a prepared life is meet your neighbor. And I'll ask you where you live, whatever situation you live, whether you've chosen to live in high density, low density, suburban, urban, rural areas, do you know your neighbor by name? Would you be able to wave and say hi to them and break up a short conversation? You know their first name, you know their last name, you know their interests, you know their kids' names. Are you a member of your community, or are you simply geolocated in a physical location that happens to have other humans in it? Those are two different things. When you build strong social capital, right? And we measure this through a number of really innovative ways that have come out in the last, and I'm working with a couple of firms here in Canada that are doing exceptional work in identifying the analytical measurement tools using some pretty aggressive SAS programming, which is brilliant. It's far beyond my technical knowledge. I'm not a programmer, but we use methodologies to be able to identify social capital and be able to measure social capital as an area and then guide the municipal emergency manager into how to leverage that. And basically it runs down to, as communities are better connected, as people see themselves as a valuable and connected member of a society, when they have a sense of place and a sense of belonging, you get access to the network, right? So if you have a tight access to 10 or 12 or 14 friends, or let's put it in if you are a member of a faith group, and this is the power of faith groups, irrespective of whether you believe in religion or not, it's the social connectedness. Now, yes, there is an exclusivity problem and there is negative social capital out there. You have to acknowledge that. But when you look at membership inside that bonding social capital that exists inside of that, right? I was a member of several churches throughout my life. And by a membership and building strong relationships with the people of the church, I had access to their resources, right? I could loan a piece of equipment that somebody else had because I had that trusted relationship. If they didn't know me and they didn't trust me and they didn't understand who I was and we didn't have a social connection, you don't loan your stuff to strangers. You loan your stuff to acquaintances and friends. The power of social capital. Social capital is the glue and lubricant that holds society together, right? Education flows along social capital networks. Financial resources flows along social capital network. Physical resources flows across social capital network. Education, everything flows across a social network. Setting up the social network, which means all of the material you need to survive a calamity exists within your social network. And when you build a strong and robust social network, you have access to that. It is clear that it is the human beings and their other personal possessions, along with a combination of your personal possessions, together as a collectivity and using the education that's provided to you, should it be created and made upon evidence-based material. That is what you need to adopt a culture of preparedness. It costs the individual absolutely no money. It is an investment of time and effort and does require a champion. And these things are longitudinal. They do not happen overnight. Somebody who thinks I'm going to create a high degree of community resilience with a short programmatic intervention will fail, and many have before. They do a one-off programmatic intervention and education within a community, and then they walk away thinking, look, this community's resilience has increased. It doesn't work that way. It takes time, it's longitudinal, and it's an investment. Most times, the best measurement we have is somewhere between 5 and 7 years, right? So adopting a preparedness does not happen overnight, but it does happen through a series of steps that an individual first has to make to accept responsibility for their outcomes and ditch the idea that they're a victim oppressed and there's barriers preventing them. Then they have to build a social relationship with the network around them. Then the right education has to be provided to that social network. And then there has to be a community champion to build community resilience, right? And we see it. Community preparedness groups are not frequent, but they are becoming more present in areas where you see in neighborhood community organizations where somebody stands up and says, hey, I'm going to start a preparedness movement within this community. I'm a member. This is the education that we've got from source X that is based in evidence, and we're going to offer it free of charge. We're going to bring people together. We're going to educate people on how to navigate disruptions and how to be prepared, how to have your trifecta of preparedness plans and the other necessity things that people have to have, all of which, my friends, all of which, in every instance, costs zero money. We have a paradigmatic shift that needs to be done within the preparedness movement because what we have is a consistent desire to place blame, that some people are victims. They don't have the money and the ability to adopt preparedness. That is untrue. That is absolutely untrue. Now, the vulnerable and marginalized populations that have a number of other variables that influence their lives do draw a disproportionate number of resources during disasters. And that is true, and it will remain true, but they are not a barrier to adopt preparedness, right? You would think that somebody with more money could simply buy the things that they need to become prepared. And that's, people believe that because what they want to believe is that somehow the rich are privileged and somehow have access to stuff they don't. They're oppressed. It's mostly found in the postmodernist movement, which is just the reworking of Marxism. And I've done shows on political ideology and preparedness, and I'll leave that there. You can go look at previous episodes to have a listen to those. But the idea basically meaning is that we lack a culture of preparedness, right? And I'm in a panel coming up on the 26th of September at the Canadian Emergency Preparedness and Climate Adaptation Conference. We have a bunch of really great speakers coming on this panel, from the Contrarian emergency manager, Tim Riker, out of the United States, Brock Long, a former head of FEMA, she is the head of the Canadian Youth Network and a proponent of the German THW network, and myself, and it's going to be moderated by Jim Montgomery, the founder of the Canadian Disaster Response Organization, and we're going to be discussing as to whether Canada needs a disaster response force. And one of the key panel meetings, at the key panel meeting, Brock Long brought it up, and he said, from his time at FEMA, he understood that if you think about a community that's prepared, if you think the community is a chair, there are 4 legs to preparedness. And he phrased them as, first, it's a culture of preparedness in society, and accepting that it is society's responsibility to take care of their outcomes, and that it is society can only be successful with a culture of preparedness. You need a strong local government. Strong in the sense is that it has a valuable connection to the people, and it has the forthwith attitude, shall we say, to deal with calamities. You need the private sector infrastructure to be involved. So in most countries, now it varies across the line, your main pieces of critical infrastructure are likely owned in a combination between the private and public sector. So the owners of those need to be critically involved in preparedness. And then you need to have the ability for the local municipal government to access resources from higher governments, not the higher government taking over, but accessing resources through a higher level government. Those four represent the four legs of a prepared society. If any one of those is missing, it puts society at high degree of risk of not having a good post-event outcome. And this is why I absolutely agree with him. Fantastic way to present it. And this is why I champion his idea of the culture of preparedness. This is the attitudinal adjustment within society, understanding that we are collective members of a tribal system in humanity, and we have responsibility to our neighbors, not only responsibility to ourselves, which is number one, but we have responsibility and duties and obligations to our neighborhood, and building that social capital, adopting a culture of preparedness, which translated from the operationalization of the theoretical framework of preparedness means that a culture of preparedness indicates you are required to be able to navigate a significant disruption of critical infrastructure, and that it is your responsibility to provide for yourself and those for whom you're responsible when a sector of critical infrastructure fails. That's a culture of preparedness. We used to have it, but when we humped through that double generational shift in the late 1990s, we now moved into a period of where we don't have that education. It's not that people are mean. It's not that people don't care. It's not that we have a millennial or Gen Z that is dumb. Like, none of this is related to the intelligence of the individuals in our urban setting, nor is it related to their socioeconomic status. It's related to the fact that we lost the culture of preparedness in a demographic shift and an urbanization through global adjustments of a whole bunch of other significant impacts. But now we're in a situation where if we can intelligently adopt a culture of preparedness, if we can accept that the road to success is not found in massive government programs and massive government involvement, but in building communities, because you can put billions and billions of additional dollars in the National Preparedness Commission and billions of dollars in FEMA, and you're not going to correlate to better post-event outcomes for the people. There's just no correlation there. The data does not support that. Now, there is a cadre of people that believe the solution to preparedness on a national level is to create national agencies. And I would offer you this, and anybody in emergency management can probably back me up, that emergency management does not suffer from a lack of bureaucracy. There's no shortage of bureaucrats, and there's no shortage of policies, regulatory frameworks, and administrative rules. No set of emergency management lacks that. What we lack is a culture of preparedness in the population. So I think we've hammered away at that enough. I'd love to hear your feedback. Jump over to our website at www.insidemycanoehead.ca. There's an email to me directly at the bottom. My firm and my team, nobody gets that. That comes directly to me. I answer them directly. Give us your feedback. What do you think on this? What are your ideas? What would you like to hear in a future episode? And if you're really animated about something, why don't you volunteer to be a guest on the podcast? We'll get you on and we'll give you a platform to rile away, and we can have a healthy intellectual debate about preparedness and about your viewpoint versus mine. Because as I wrote in a recent blog, we've lost the ability to debate and discourse because you and I have a difference of opinion and we come to different conclusions. Doesn't mean I'm right, and it doesn't mean you're wrong. It doesn't mean I'm a fool. It doesn't mean I lack an education. It doesn't mean I need more exposure to something. No, it simply means that you and I have a different conclusion and that we can learn from each other. That's the way the world used to be before cancel culture took over. Now we have nothing but a total plethora of attacks on personality, character, and everything else. It is somehow some people's responsibility online to prove the other people wrong, right? I must persuade you that I am correct. And if you don't agree with me, you're somehow weak, unintelligent, uneducated, or uninformed. People can't simply expect that I'm a well-educated person, you're a well-educated person. We've both spent well over a decade in preparedness, education, and communications work, and we have different ideas. Wow, what an incredible world if we could just leave it at that and we could have an intellectual debate about our differences instead of character assassination. I still stay online. I engage with everybody across social media platforms because I think we need to still keep doing this. Yes, I get called everything under the sun. I get told everything. I'd get told I have a privilege for some example. Anyhow, there's a whole bunch of people out there that instead of understanding the idea and accepting that different ideas may actually be true and that there may be a crack in the foundation of their idea, they would prefer to attack somebody else. What an idea. I've been educated on things along the way, and I love hearing different viewpoints, and I hope you do here. And I hope you continue to listen to this podcast, and I hope you understand that there are different ideas out there. So listen up, follow the podcast, and if you do one thing for us here at Inside My Canoe Head, share the existence of this podcast with others. We're downloaded in over 900 locations around the globe. This is free, always will be free. It is here. It is our piece of evidence-based, non-apocalyptic preparedness education for rational people. Take care and stay safe.